For those of you who are watching, who are with us right now, we encourage you to post questions and comments in the comment section of the Facebook page, Archer's page. For those of you who are here with us, we also want to hear from you. So if you have questions and comments, feel free to put them in the chat. We have the pleasure and honor of welcoming our guest speakers tonight, Dr. Viorica Marian and Dr. Lisa Wisniewski. The conversation will be moderated by Anna Maria Hoșbota, our editor-in-chief at Archer, and myself, Mihaela Campion, the president of the board. I would also like to extend a thank you to everyone at Archer, Roxana Kazan, our executive director, who is here with us tonight. Also, all the members, the team, the board members. I hope some of them will join or watch on Facebook. And we'll like to hear more, to learn from each other, and to grow. To our guests, first, I would like to welcome you. Thank you for accepting our invitation with us. It's a pleasure. And I would like to start by asking you to please tell us who you are. So Viorica, if you want to start, please do so. Tell us a few words about you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I am honored to be here and delighted to be here. Romanian is my native language. I was born in Moldova, so I'm originally from Chișinău. I grew up speaking Romanian at home, Russian outside the home, because Russian was the official language during the Soviet years in Moldova. I started studying English in school, and in the late 80s, I came to the United States for the first time with an exchange program, and then later in 91 moved here permanently. Since 2000, I have been a professor at Northwestern studying bilingualism and multilingualism and how the interaction how language interacts with the mind, the consequences of knowing multiple languages for cognition and the brain. I actually see some people from my research team here today also joining us, so I'm looking forward to the research on bilingualism and multilingualism that we do, since many of us here speak multiple languages and are living our lives across two languages. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Lisa.
Thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation today. My name is Dr. Lisa Wisniewski. I am a professor of sociology at Goodwin University in East Hartford, Connecticut. I am born and raised in the United States to parents from Poland. My whole life was raised in the Polish diaspora here, but while I'm a fully American citizen, a lot of my based on Poland and living there. So I like to tell people I went to school 6 days a week in my elementary years, because on Saturday I went to Polish school, and that was a non-negotiable. That was one of the early experiences that shaped my life in terms of another language and who I became. As a sociologist, I study first-generation college students and students who are immigrants and providing educational opportunities and access to immigrant communities. While I've been focused on Eastern European communities, you'll find that a lot of the pathways are similar to all groups. Through continuing the conversation about language and how it shapes our identities and our ways of knowing the world. So thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening.
Thank you for, it's really a pleasure. For those of you who'd like to know more about Dr. Viorica Marian and Dr. Lisa Wisniewski, you can read their full bios on our Facebook page. And also Roxana will put it in the chat tonight. I would like to start, with the first question for Viorica. You have this new book out, The Power of Language. I'm going to show it again because it's my manual, my latest manual. The book is receiving a wide recognition and it's being translated into 12 languages and counting. What made you decide to write this book? Why this topic?
Thank you for that question, Mihaela. So, quote that you mentioned in your invite, and it's one of my favorite quotes about writing a book. It comes from Toni Morrison, who said that if there is a book you want to read that hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so this book is a book I've always wanted to read, but hadn't been written yet. So I've been teenager, really. But when I'd go to and in my courses in college, most of the books and most of the research out there centered on language and cognition and people who only spoke one language. So that's really the norm for studying language and mind. As I started doing research on bilingualism and publishing scientific articles on that, I realized that there are still a lot of misconceptions out there that people have about people who speak multiple languages. Many consider bilingualism evidence for that. And when you write scientific articles, when you conduct research and publish it in peer-reviewed journals, you reach only a small audience. Basically people who work in your field around the world at universities and different labs, but you don't reach a broad audience, a general readership audience. So as soon as I had the opportunity to write during the pandemic when we were all working from home, I really made it a priority to make this research, cutting edge research in the field, available to a broad readership and accessible for broad readership. So this is how this book was born.
And we are happy to have it. According to my knowledge, we don't have a lot of books about the impact of language in general, the way which the reflection of how we think and how we feel, and also on bilingualism. Thank you for doing this, and I hope it's going to be followed by another one.
Yes, we have a few titles in sociolinguistics, but not one that focuses as Dr. Marian's book on all the aspects involved in the languages, thought processes, our emotions, and the choices that we do every day. So I think it's a great synthesis of the last decade's research on psycholinguistics. So my first question would be around these two aspects, like first, research, and secondly, mental health. Are bilinguals and multilinguals underrepresented in research and underserved in the clinical services? And if yes, how is that a problem? And how are we currently working to remedy that situation?
Thank you, Anna. That's a really good question too. So before answering whether bilinguals are underrepresented in research, I'll take a step back to say that many people here may be surprised to know that bilinguals and multilinguals are actually the majority in the world. More than half of the world's population speaks 2 or more languages or dialects. It is very common for people all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in Africa, just around the world, to grow up with 2 or more languages from an early age, and then later acquire additional languages later in life. Why am I saying this? Well, because while the majority of the world's population is bilingual or multilingual, most research, including clinical research, educational research, therapeutic research, and just research in general, continues to focus on speakers of one language for the most part, and it's done on what's known as weird populations. WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich Democratic Nations. So there's a disproportionate amount of research done on people from these populations, even though they are the minority really in the world. So what happens when you leave out this huge segment of the population, more than half of the world's population? Well, what happens is you get, at best, an incomplete, but really an inaccurate understanding of how language works, how the mind works, the interaction between language and mind, about human capacity and human potential more broadly. So in order to really have a more complete and accurate understanding of the interaction between language and mind, it is really important that we broaden our research and include linguistically diverse populations, bilinguals, multilinguals, speakers of different languages and dialects in our research. There are many implications for clinical, therapeutic, legal, educational settings that come out from laboratory research with bilinguals and multilinguals. And as we continue this discussion, as we talk about different research areas, we can consider some of those implications as well. So this is a long answer to your question that basically says that yes, this group is underrepresented in research, and as a result, it's also underserved in clinical services.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we definitely need to answer a lot of questions. Like 2 years ago, I started a research on Romanians living in diaspora, and the first question was, okay, what language are we gonna interrogate our research participants in? And it's not a clear question. If you use the norms of your the majority population or the country of origin population, and there's definitely like in a lot to cover in research. What are
so just to follow up on that, I will give you 2 examples that illustrate this issue. And one comes from our lab where we were studying. So for those, I'll give you an example from autoacoustic emissions. For those of you who don't know what autoacoustic emissions are, most of us know that our ears process incoming sound and our brain decodes the sounds from the environment, but it turns out that our ears also actually emit sounds. If you put a very sensitive microphone next to the into the ear, it records the sounds that our ears produce, which are known as autoacoustic emissions. And we don't really know what the purpose of this spontaneous autoacoustic emissions are. Do they serve any purpose, or are they just a sort of an evolutionary leftover like the vestigial tail? And it wasn't until bilinguals and multilinguals were included in a research study in a collaborative project between our lab and a lab that studies autoacoustic emissions that we saw that bilinguals and multilinguals autoacoustic emissions were a little bit different. It seemed that their brain, through top-down cognitive control, modulated the amplitude of this emission. So what this suggests is that these autoacoustic emissions are not random, that there seems to be some relationship between them and higher cognitive functions, even though we don't yet know what their purpose and what that relationship is. So this is opening the door to much more research down the line that will hopefully tell us more about autoacoustic emission. And this is just one area, small area that shows how you can discover things that you wouldn't otherwise discover unless you include this population, the speakers of multiple languages, because our brains are equipped to handle multiple languages. And an analogy that I can make for that is how in the medical field for decades, most research was done on men and usually on white men, which gave us an inaccurate understanding of, for example, heart disease in women or diabetes in indigenous populations of North and South America, because heart disease manifests differently in women and sugar is processed differently in the indigenous populations of North and South America. So by not including those populations in research, we didn't really have a full understanding of heart disease and diabetes. In the same way, as not including bilinguals and multilinguals in medical research, clinical research, and just broadening our approach and who we include in our work would give us a better understanding of our brain. So I'll stop on that.
Thank you so much. That's very, very interesting. And I hope to read more on that. I loved how you presented all the benefits that multilingualism, bilingualism brings to the brain, how it enhances the cognitive reserve and sharpens our cognitive executive function. And of course, that is important, but getting so excited about all the benefits it brings, we tend to oversee the biases that still members of linguistic minorities face every day in employment settings, legal and health settings, we already mentioned. So there's definitely still a gap in their opportunities. So I want to ask Lisa this time, what is her opinion on these biases members of linguistic minorities still face every day? And you can answer as a researcher and educator of immigrant students, as a member of a diaspora too. I think we are currently talking enough about it and doing enough to remedy these biases, or to put it better, to compensate for the existing biases, because a lot of them are embedded in our educational system and the way the society is set up.
So I can certainly answer the question as a researcher and educator and as a community member. And I think my answer will span sort of all of those, right? The simplest way I'll answer is we are not doing enough and we can certainly do more. And, so let's sort of clarify why I say that. To our current theme, there's a lot of communities, especially diaspora communities, that are missing in all types of research, whether it's about multilingualism or education. I mean, that is what really made my dissertation unique, because since about the 70s, Eastern European communities are not studied in educational literature. So one of my first challenges in my dissertation was actually finding literature, right, which almost stopped me from progressing. So that, I say that as it's significant, because if we're not hearing the stories of the community, are we simply aware of what is going on in the community? And that leads me to why I said what I said. We're not really aware of what community members are feeling, right? We're not really aware of what their stories are and what the issues are, right? Some of that is community members don't report. We report to each other, but maybe not to the majority community, right? We'll go and talk to our friends, our aunts about what's happening. We'll get their advice. It's probably not good advice. And then we, provide that pathway a different way. Who else do you have to ask? Right? So that's number one. If the majority community or the professional community isn't aware that this group is having an issue, then how can they provide supports, right? How can we provide programs, supports, or whatever it may be to minimize that bias or to provide bridges and pathways to get there, right? And, something that's already been said, when the US is quite unique, where for the most part, most people speak another language, but it's not as in other parts of the world, right? Where we're learning a different language more frequently than, let's say, in the US, right? While we do have that in, K through 12 education, and that's expanded over the last 20 years, is there really a focus on fluency and use of this language in adulthood, right? The predominance is English. So, someone described to me what it's like to be to move to a different country, especially in adulthood. And the way they said it stuck with me, because they said, as an adult, you start to feel like you're 3 years old again. You have to rely on other adults or other individuals to explain these things to you. But as an adult, that's very uncomfortable, because you're used to having the autonomy and the freedom to take care of what you need to take care of. And now here you are without the use of the language. How else would you feel other than 3? And that creates stigma and fear and bias and all of these feelings that are hard to overcome or admit as an adult, right? So if we're, to sort of sum up, if we're not sharing these stories, if we're not conducting the research, if we're not going into communities and having these conversations, then we're simply, as a majority community, not aware of what's happening. And therefore, we're not providing the proper supports that are necessary. So I guess I'll be working for the rest of my life creating those research. That research will never be complete, and done.
Yeah, thank you so much. And encouraging people to open up and fight the implicit norm. A lot of diaspora communities have that if you complain about the barriers you're facing or the problems you're facing, you're either incompetent or you're not grateful to the majority culture that's receiving you, and it's like a taboo. Jessica, did you want to?
Yes.
We didn't hear you, Mihaela. Sorry.
I think that it's a wonderful, dedicated mission that you are on, Lisa. Yeah. Okay, I have a question for Viorica. And after we hear your answer, Lisa, feel free to, step in and add if you wish, because it's a question that I'm sure you have your own experience in working with this. Viorica, you talk in the book about gender stereotypes and how they influence our perceptions of people, including the perception of ourselves, right? And also how it shapes the lives we live. Can you elaborate on what are some ways in which language shapes how we think about gender?
That question is right up the alley with our social justice topic here. So language and mind are very tightly connected. The language we use shapes how we think about ourselves and how we think about the world in general. We usually think about the world and the world around us as this objective reality, but that's not really the case. We don't live in an objective reality. We live in a subjective world that's very much influenced by our experiences, and how we see the world, how we perceive the environment and others is shaped by multiple experiences we've had in the past, including our gender is not unique in that. It's just one aspect that is shaped by the languages that we know. And I'll give you one example that has been particularly well researched there, which is grammatical gender. And for those on Facebook who may be monolingual speakers or who speak languages that don't have a grammatical gender, let me explain what I mean by that. So in English, all inanimate objects are referred to as it. But in many other languages, including Romanian and all other Latin-based languages, Romance languages, as well as in many Slavic languages, Germanic languages, and just many languages around the world, inanimate objects are referred to with gender pronouns, either a he or a she, or in some languages, a neutral pronoun exists like it, and in other languages, there are actually more than these masculine, feminine pronouns. So, like a pen may be a she in one language or a he in another language. And for people who speak languages that don't have grammatical gender, this can be just a really surprising thing to wrap your mind around. Like, how do you decide what's a he and what's a she, and why is a pen feminine, for example, in Russian, but a pencil is masculine in Russian? And why is a pen masculine? I'm thinking through right now in Romanian, for example. And Romanian, it's actually a very unusual language where many nouns are masculine in singular form and feminine in plural form, including pen or chair, for example. And you may think that this is just a random fact about languages, but it actually turns out that even something as seemingly insignificant as the grammatical gender of the inanimate objects in our lives shapes how we think about those objects. And I'll give you some experiment examples from research labs. This comes from Dr. Lera Boroditsky's lab at Stanford and at University of California, San Diego, who's been testing speakers of languages that have grammatical gender and finding that they actually represent those objects differently in their life. So she would take items like a key that has, and test speakers of German and Spanish, or bridge, and again, test speakers of German and Spanish. And she finds that if the grammatical gender for key is feminine in your language, you tend to describe it with words like golden, small, tiny, intricate, just this kind of adjectives. But if it's masculine, you tend to describe it with adjectives like metal, rugged, serrated, useful. So different kinds of adjectives there as well. And she would flip it across languages just to make sure that it's not that speakers of this language always refer to things more in a more feminine way and in a more masculine way. So she'd switch the gender. And once again, even when she switches it, she'd find that speakers who in whose language key was feminine, if they were asked to describe a noun like bridge that was masculine, they would describe it with adjectives like, big again, or useful, or, just nouns that independent speakers tended, adjectives that independent speakers tended to rate as more masculine, which in itself is a problem, perhaps, in how we represent masculinity and femininity. But it goes to show that even the objects we interact with, our mental representations of these objects are influenced by small linguistic characteristics like grammatical gender. And it's not just in how we think about those objects, but also in how we remembered them. So in other experiments, she found, this particular lab found that we remember things better if there is a congruent relationship between the grammatical gender of an object and properties of that object. So, for example, she would take inanimate objects, like a pen again, or an apple, and give it a name, either Patricia or Patrick. And then she'd test, and so she'd present people with multiple items like that, and then she'd test their memory. And she'd find that memory was better when the label was the same as the grammatical gender of that object in a language. So it just shows how entrenched this gender effects are in how we think about the world around us. We just basically immediately activate biases and attributes and our own preconception about gender just by using different linguistic components. There've been movements in some countries to try and abandon things like grammatical gender, but that didn't work. So it's very hard to completely abandon grammatical gender from a language altogether. So instead, now our languages are adding a gender neutral pronoun towards that in speakers of some languages. But this is one research example on how gender shapes how language shapes how we think about gender. And maybe Lisa would like to mention some other work. I'll give her a chance to talk as well.
Well, thank you for sharing those examples. I just learned so much in just hearing those studies. Just some anecdotal thoughts to the question is, again, being born in the U.S., learning Polish before I spoke English. But at this point in my life, English is the predominant language. And I'm trying to catch up on my Polish to be sort of equal, right? But my thoughts automatically when I think about gender and language go to roles, right? Not necessarily sentence structure and all of that, but it goes to roles because I'm used to using she, he in a sentence, right? Not necessarily in objects, right? Versus while I'm trying to pick up greater vocabulary in Polish, because that is my challenge right now to myself. One of the things I am struggling with is the gender, the gender in Polish, right? And in a, again, just funny way, my husband is a native speaker of Polish, came here when he was 15 years old, and I have to constantly ask him which ending to use on a word, and I just cannot get it correct. And I finally ask him, how do you know? And his answer is, you just know, right? Like, you just know, you're supposed to know it. So even thinking about what I think gender means, because my mind went straight to roles. What does it mean, to be female? What does that mean, to how I act in my behavior, right? But hearing those research examples, I never even thought about how words are sort of connected into, how we also continue to describe the object and or feel about the object as well.
We have a comment here that I'm going to read it now because it applies to the topic on Facebook. So we have a comment from Ioana Moraru on Facebook who says, God defaults to masculine. This has always intrigued me. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, in all religions, I cannot speak for all religions, but God doesn't have gender. If you are a religious person, you think of God as one and all. So it's interesting how minds attribute gender and how language also shapes our religious thought. In fact, it's an entirely sort of other topic if we go into language and religion, but many religious ideas also filtered through our language and the vocabulary we have and the grammar we have. So there are religious scholars of all religions that devote the entire life and have for centuries to try and interpret the original records in different religious faiths. So thinking about God within the prism of a gender is, of course, not appropriate. And we have a questions and answers section at the end, right? Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so we can take that into different directions. I've thought a lot about language and religion. I'd be happy to talk more about that if there are questions about that later.
Yeah, it was more of a comment than a question. That's why I posted now. Lisa, do you want to add anything to this?
I thought right away of who tells the story, right? To Viorica's comments that, they're attributing gender to God is essentially it's not correct, but thinking about the ways that we passed on the religious stories, right? And who wrote the stories and what language was used, and sort of thinking about how whoever did that ascribed, these norms that we have, like gender, like, and also what comes with those gender norms as well. So thinking about who writes the story as well.
Thank you. Thank you both. Back to you, Viorica. I'm sorry, was anybody?
Go on, Mihail. I wanted to ask something, but go ahead, Mihail. Sorry.
Viorica, back to you. Does language, and if it does, how influence how we think about race?
Oh, okay. Another good social justice question. Before I answer that, I do want to actually make sure we know that to mention that God is not masculine in all religions. There are polytheistic religions, religions where there are multiple gods. And in those religions, some gods are male, female, and some blend genders. Or so if we look beyond Christianity, most Romanian speakers are Romanian Orthodox. Not all gods are male. Okay, so your question was, does language influence how we think about race, right? So to answer this example, I'll approach it, this question, I'll approach it a little bit differently. In the language, in the gender question, I used grammar as an example to show how grammar shapes how we think and how we represent the world. For race, I'll use lexicon, basically the words that we use to illustrate how the relationship between language and race, because it's multiple aspects of language influence how we think. It's the grammar we use, it's the words we use, it's the pragmatics, it just multiple components influence our representation of the world. So in the one example that can be very salient is to think about the word slave. And when you hear the word slave, you represent certain things in your mind. If you just change the wording and instead of saying slaves, you use the words enslaved people or people who were enslaved, you immediately represent things differently. And it's one example of the power of words and the power of language and how it shifts and changes how we think about our reference, depending on the words that we use. Another example I can use to talk about the power of language and race is to refer to bring in the African-American English dialect. There are a lot of biases and misconceptions surrounding the African-American English dialect, which is one of the most spoken dialects in the United States. And usually these biases and these misconceptions are negative, which is very interesting because in the United States and all around the world, there are multiple dialects. It depends on region, it depends on so many things. There are just speaking multiple dialects is very common around the world. There is even this famous linguistic saying that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So if you go to other countries, you can see that sometimes linguistic varieties that are very different are considered dialects of the same language, often for political reasons, and then linguistic varieties that are very similar are considered different languages, also for oftentimes political reasons. And Moldovan and Romanian are a prime example of that, where linguists consider them the same language and dialects of the same language. There is no language. There is no Moldovan language, but of course, during the Soviet years, politically, it was artificially created and given an alphabet and really used to try and shape the identity of people who lived in Moldova to make them more pro-East as opposed to pro-West. So circling back to African-American English, it is a dialect that's spoken by a large proportion of population in the United States, about 12%, more than 12% if you include more diverse individuals. And it's often referred to as broken English or just incorrect English. Interestingly, the grammatical patterns, and not just the grammatical, the linguistic patterns that exist in African-American English can be traced back to many West African languages. So, for example, the double negative in African-American English is incorrect in standard English. So you would say, I don't have a pen, versus I don't have no pen. And if a child uses this dialect, they would be considered speaking sort of broken, incorrect English, sometimes even misdiagnosed, depending on different features of a dialect, as having a language difficulty or language delay or language disorder with a communicative challenge. But it turns out that many West African languages, and not just West African languages, many of the structures that exist in African American English exist in other languages as well. So it seems that that African American English is a linguistic variation that evolved as a result of interaction between different language forms. So what happened, if you think back and trace it to its origins, you would often have people who were enslaved from different countries in Africa and West Africa specifically, who were brought to the New World and would often find themselves on plantations with speakers of other African languages. So they didn't have a language in common. There maybe was the base language that the person who owned the plantation used. Maybe it was English or Spanish or French or Dutch. And then all these languages, West African languages, would be brought into that context. So this need for people to interact and to communicate would lead to language contact and eventually a fusion of the words, the rules, the characteristics of language to combine and create this form that that was influenced by multiple languages. And you have that in African American English in the United States. You have this in Creole languages everywhere, pretty much, where people who were enslaved were brought in, including the Patois dialect, for example, in Jamaica, many French dialects. I have a colleague who I think is here as well, who speaks a Mauritian dialect. So all of these dialects around the world have evolved because language constantly changes to become a linguistic variety that people speak today. So this is one example of how language and race are interconnected, and then influence how people speak and how people express themselves. Oftentimes, unfortunately, because of the biases that are really not specific to a language and intrinsic to a language, speakers of that languages have to face discrimination and challenges that speakers of other dialects don't necessarily face. Okay, so that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. What's your perception and experience with this, Lisa?
I think one of the things where my mind has been going lately on language, and I have not conducted the study in, perhaps that's the next phase, but thinking about the connection of language and power, right? The book is called The Power of Language, right? But also looking at how language is powerful. How is it used? How is it used to create positive or negative connotations to words, right? Something that we could take as positive, but we could attach a negative meaning to it, right? Or, view one language as, or one dialect, right, as more official or not official. And what does that mean? And how are we labeling individuals who are speaking that dialect or speaking that language, right? And also back to some of my earlier comments, the language we use gives us autonomy and power, right? In order to even think about, taking care of the most simplest basic needs, right? Get a job, go get a driver's license effectively by yourself, right? And if we are sort of creating hierarchies of language that, or languages or dialects that are predominant or proper versus others, are we creating biases within that by using that language? And how are we creating those social structures and reinforcing norms, into that, right? I live in Connecticut. I live in, the Northeast United States. Even between Connecticut and Massachusetts, there's a very significant accent and dialect change, right? And what do we sort of attribute that to? Early settlers, early colonization, right, of the United States. But why is that dialect okay versus others may not be, and who made that choice, who made that decision, right? So sort of thinking about how we prioritize language and how that may shape how we view individuals, groups of people, and also the languages and the words that we continue to use.
Thank you. Quick reminder to those who joined us later. We will have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to post them in chat here. Or for those who are live on Facebook, please write them in the comment section on the page. Thank you.
I will ask the next questions to both of you. It's a parenting question. So even if it has been demonstrated that teaching your child another language than your native one is not the best thing to do, because in the native language you have a riches of vocabulary and you control the grammar, and you're definitely more expressive, both linguistically and emotionally. Many parents are still told by educators, specialists, or pediatricians not to teach their children to speak in their own native language, and because it will confuse them or produce language delays. I want to know to what extent that information is true, and also related to this, there's a question that I wanted to ask at the end, but I'll ask it now. Do you think the diasporas and also the American government does enough to encourage language preservation in diasporic communities? So I hope I didn't ask too much. Viorica.
Lisa, would you like to answer it first, or would you like me to answer it first?
You go first, and I'll pick up after.
Okay, sure. I think you're right that many parents are often told not to speak their native language with their children, and there's this misconception that speaking or raising children with more than one language will confuse them and will lead to delay, disorder, just will be problematic. Some of the thought behind that comes from people who really don't have experience with bilinguals and multilinguals, especially if it's a monolingual person in a monolingual society. And some of this is also based on old research. So early on, research on bilingual children would sometimes find differences, for example, in IQ between children who are being raised with two or more languages versus children who are monolingual. But it turns out that that research was very much flawed, that it was done, it had confounding variables like social economic status and parental education. So things like income, for example, a lot of that early research was done on lower social economic status communities, maybe migrant children, children whose parents did not have the opportunity to obtain higher education or have a stable employment situation. Once this was corrected for example, by testing bilingual children in countries where bilingualism was a national policy, like in the Quebec area of Canada or in many European countries, the relationship between bilingualism and IQ, for example, cognitive performance, disappeared. So the way I interpret those studies, and what I always say, is that it turns out that it's not bilingualism that's bad for you, but poverty is what is detrimental to cognitive development and IQ and other things like that. On the contrary, if you actually look at providing children with a rich environment, be it as a linguistic environment or musical environment or just any kind of enriched environment, auditory, visual, tactile, it contributes to neural development, brain development, and it's actually a very good thing. So there is no evidence that raising children with 2 or more languages leads to communicative disorders or any clinical issues. And if you look long term over the lifespan, and there are actually quite a few benefits to growing up with 2 or more languages. And I'm happy to talk about that more if interested. But before I pass the torch to Lisa, these biases are often facing predominantly, continue to face immigrant communities. So what I mean by that is if you look at higher social economic status, upper class families and upper middle class families, they often understand that bilingualism and multilingualism is a beneficial thing. So they would sign up their children for language lessons. They would send them on programs abroad, exchange programs. They'd hire tutors for other languages and just make sure, or hire childcare providers who speak different languages to really give their kids this opportunities of being bilingual and multilingual, because they understand that it will have long-term benefits in employment opportunities and age and cognitive development, just lots of wonderful things. So you have this on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have lower social economic status communities, lower class and lower middle class, often immigrants who have already another language at home, who are specifically told to not use that other language, coming from perhaps biases that have nothing to do with bilingualism and multilingualism. So there is no evidence that bilingualism is detrimental, and there are quite a few benefits to raising children with 2 or more languages. On to you, Lisa.
I'm in complete agreement. And I will say this was parenting advice that my mother never took. She was very much like, you're learning Polish as much as you can, and you're going to Polish school. There was no discussion about that, right? So being the child, being raised this way, I can speak from sort of that perspective. I didn't speak English until I was 4 or 5 years old, right? I only spoke Polish in the household, even though I was born in the US, right? I learned English when I went to preschool. And that's sort of the way that it was done in the 80s, if you will, right? You just speak everything at home, sort of encompass the child and send them off to school. And the theory was, guess what? They'll pick it up. They're 4 or 5, they will learn very quickly, right? So while we know as researchers that there are nothing but benefits to being bilingual, the one thing I will just add, I think it's really important now that we know more, right, about the research and language development. I think it's just really important on the opposite side, right, to also, as the child is learning English, right? So let's say that's the approach you take, right, of learning English at home. Learning the native language or the home language at home. When that child is transitioning to learn English, perhaps just be open to the supports that are required, right? Now that we, again, know more, there are a lot more English language learner programs in K through 12, right? That child may, be recommended to take that program, have that open mind so that they can have sort of that early grammatical or early language development. I think sometimes diaspora communities don't take that step, right? In sort of practical application, it's just they'll learn it, they'll be fine, right? But then what happens is, if you're like me, I'm grammatically stuck between 2 languages, right? I need an editor for everything I do, right? Because the idea was, essentially what I'm saying is, don't just rely on the conversation, provide the supports of learning a language in both the home-based language and English as well, and sort of have both of those mindsets in order to support especially young children in that development.
Excellent points. We all still have a lot to learn when it comes to practicing what we know and continuing to learn and evolve. Because language, I think it's a life, right? If I'm understanding it well, I'm not a specialist, but I see how much it changes, and it changes for better in so many ways. We learn how to speak better. We learn how to express especially when it comes to emotions. It's a completely new trend now. The words and increasing our vocabulary, the emotional vocabulary, the sensory vocabulary. I think in the book, Viorica, you mentioned that without being completely demonstrated, someone who is bilingual may have a wider range of words available to express emotions. And correlate emotions to behaviors. We don't know. I mean, I have to say I'm not sure about that. I'm paying more attention after I read it in the book, mainly because I think the vocabulary in itself, the emotional vocabulary that we have in one language, may be in need to evolve. And the more we do that in one language, the more we do it in another language as well, or in the second language. But I can see that if I know words in English to express my emotions and I know words in Romanian to express my emotions, then I have a wider range of possibilities than others who are monolingual. But that doesn't mean that we don't, continuously learn and develop, actually, when it comes to emotions, behaviors, expressions, and so on. If you want to add anything on this, Viorica, it would be very interesting, and we probably have to have a 2 hours conversation only on this topic.
Yes, well, you are a therapist, so you have a lot of experience working with clients and discussing emotional subjects within in both languages. So I'd love to hear about your professional experience there as well. Yes, so I talk about that. The book is structured into 2 parts. One talks about language and the self and identity, and one is structured on language and a broader sort of social prism. So up until now, we've talked a lot about this broader social prism, but this is a good question about how language shapes our identities and how when people use their 2 languages, they often express being slightly different versions of themselves. And thinking about themselves differently, remembering things differently, experiencing emotions differently, just changes in their identity. Remembering things, deciding things differently depending upon the language they speak, including the emotional connection with their experiences tends to change across languages. We know, even in monolinguals, we often know that in therapy, we tell clients and we also tell children to label their emotions to help process what they're feeling by labeling their emotions. Once you label how you are feeling, it helps you process what you are feeling. And languages vary in the labels they have for emotions. And even when you have words in both languages, they express slightly different things. So, for example, I love you elicits different feelings to the person who says them and also to the person who hears these words, depending on whether it's the native language or the second language. Other intense emotion words, things like cursing, also elicits different responses in the native language versus in the second language. It turns out that the native language is often more closely connected it's more emotional. It tends to elicit more intense feelings. And then the second language is often described as allowing more distance and more of a logical perspective. One of my colleagues, Aya Williams, who I think may be here as well, does research on bilinguals in psychotherapy and finds that switching between languages, code switching, can help provide distance or bring more into focus, make more emotions more salient. And sometimes it can be actually a very useful therapeutic tool. So if a memory is so traumatic that it's extremely painful and difficult to access it, switching to the second language can provide some distance that allows you to work through the trauma and process the emotion and eventually get to the other side in ways that using the native language just does it make possible because it's just such an intense experience. One of the case studies is of a woman who experienced intense abuse in and by speakers of native language, and only by switching to another language was she able to really adequately process that experience. On the other hand, sometimes getting in touch with important feelings and overcoming obstacles can be brought into focus more when you switch into the native language that gives you that access to more intense emotions. So most definitely emotions are connected to language, connected to how we experience ourselves, our relationships, our interactions with others. And it's really quite a broad topic that I'm happy to follow up if later people have questions with more to say on that.
It's a vast and fascinating topic, for sure. Shifting gears a little bit here, I would like to ask you, and Lisa as well, what are some ways in which language shapes how we think about nature and the environment?
Lisa, would you like to talk about that, or would you like me to start?
Good start, and I'll pick up.
Okay, sure. So in the book, I talk about that as well. And I talk about how powerful our language is and how we think about nature and our environment. We already talked about grammatical gender as masculine and feminine. Another linguistic example like that has to do with animate versus inanimate concepts. So in English and in Romanian and in many other languages, we think of humans as this very special animate creatures. We think of animals also as animate creatures, but we think of other natural items like trees and other natural entities like trees and flowers and mushrooms and just plants in general as inanimate, and we refer to them as it. That's not the case for many indigenous languages of North America, where inanimate, what we consider inanimate items, but basically entities that refer to nature, are also referred to with animate pronouns. So instead of an it and an inanimate pronoun, anything that's a natural item that is not man-made is referred to with an animate pronoun, and often thought about and referred to with linguistic units that refer to them as related to us, part of our family, maybe not direct cousins, but basically cousins or relatives, or relatives is the right word for it. So those languages encode not only animacy, but our closer relationship with natural items like trees and other plants. And that also shifts how we think about the environment and us being part of the world and part of nature, as opposed to distinct and special and different. It's interesting because in English, we often use animate pronouns and give even names to items like trucks or boats or guns, and we would give them names and we call it a she, but then go and use an inanimate it referent to talk about living and breathing entities that are part of our natural world. So this helps us feel either distant or closer to nature, and shifts how we think about our relationship and our place in the natural world. So here's a linguistic example that has implications for how we treat nature, how we interact with the environment, and explains why some languages and some cultures, speakers of those languages in the indigenous North and South American community, perhaps have a closer relationship to nature and how dedicated they are to protecting the environment and protecting the planet, and perhaps has lessons and implications for speakers of languages and people from cultures who think that humans are special, which is now having all this negative impacts on our climate and on nature in general.
Thank you.
I would just sort of add and reinforce, sort of how that language shapes, again, our behavior then, right? About whether close or distant to nature, the environment, or whatever the topic is that we're talking about, can then shape how we interact with those things, right? Do we recycle, for example, or do we not engage in certain behaviors that are not good for the climate and the environment, and how so again, how language just continues to shape our behavior, with the nature and environment being one core example.
Thank you both. Another topic that can be discussed extensively. Another question for both of you. Does language, and I think this is our last question, because we would like to leave some time for the audience to relate to what we discussed here tonight and ask questions or make comments. The last question for both of you: does language influence our understanding of morality and of right and wrong?
Viorica, please feel free to start and I'll pick up.
Okay, sure. Absolutely, it does. Like I mentioned before, language shapes our identities. It shapes how we think about ourselves. It shapes the decisions we make. When we change languages, people even actually score differently on personality tests, depending on the languages they use. They think differently about their relationships with other people. They even vote differently. One of my students was telling me, one of my students in my classes, how when he considered a decision about who to date and who to marry, there's this girl he was dating and he was trying to decide whether to marry her. When he was thinking in Korean, he would come to one decision, and when he was thinking in English, he would come to another decision. And these kind of differences translate to all aspects of our lives, including morality. I'll tell you just about a couple of experiments, one on cheating and one on really what's right and what's wrong. And the right and wrong example comes from this very famous trolley dilemma problem that many in the audience may be familiar with. So in this version of the trolley dilemma, you are standing on a footbridge above some train tracks, and there are 5 workers working on those train tracks. A trolley is coming at a very fast speed, and it's about to run over these 5 workers and kill them. So you have a choice. You're standing next to this large person with a large backpack. If you push this person off the bridge, the person will fall, and when he falls, he'd stop the trolley, saving the life of those five people, but dying himself. And then the question is it permissible to sacrifice the life of this one person to save the life of 5 people? So if I were to ask you this question, what would you say? Would you say that it is permissible or not? Yeah, so as you think about it, as you think about it, it turns out that there are multiple things that influence one's decision. But when you ask people in the native language, only about 20% would say that, yes, it is permissible to sacrifice the life of one person to save the life of 5 people. When you ask this question in the second language, 33% would say that it's permissible to sacrifice the life of one person to save the life of 5 people. This research was done by my colleagues at Yuri Hayakawa and Boaz Kaiser at the University of Chicago and Albert Costa in Spain, basically showing a double-digit change in the proportion of people who say that it is permissible to sacrifice the life of one person to save 5. And we see these patterns in other experiments as well that show that when you use the second language, you're more likely to make what's decision, something that benefits the greater good, as opposed to when you use your native language, you're more likely to make what's known as a deontological decision. So guided by what you consider morally right or wrong. And the native language, as we talked previously, is more closely tied to emotion. So when you make this decision in the native language, you're much more likely to elicit all these emotions that make you think that no, it's never okay to sacrifice the life of one person. So simply by shifting the language you use, you could be making different decisions. And in studies on investing, this has also been the case. People make more logical decisions. Just about in most domains on one's life, you can try thinking about the problem in two languages, and sometimes you would arrive to different decisions. Cheating is another area. So in an experiment, people were asked to roll a die and then report to the experiment, and this is also Sayuri Hayakawa's and Wisniewski's research, and then report the number that they got. And depending on what number they would report, they'd get a certain amount of money. So if they say that they rolled a 1, they would get $1. And if they'd say that they rolled a 6, they get $6, for example. And only the person who's rolling the die can see what number they got. The experimenter can't. It's like you're rolling it and then you're looking at the number. And if you just think about statistical probability, you should be seeing an equal distribution of a 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4, 5, and 6. But as you might expect, a lot more people, surprise, rolled a 5 or a 6 than a 1 and a 2. So but there was a difference in how often people would basically cheat and report getting one number versus another in the native language versus a second language. So just even the likelihood of lying and cheating can change depending on the language you use. So you can see how our language shapes our decision making, and writers, people who write and people who live in their two languages often report this differences themselves. We just recently ran a study on medical decision making, where we asked bilinguals to answer a bunch of questions in either their native language or their second language about, how likely they are to accept experimental treatment, how likely they are to trust the doctor's opinion, all kind of medical decisions, how likely they are to accept vaccines. And we find that people differ in their native language versus second language. For example, they're more likely to accept experimental treatments in the second language than in their native language. They are more likely to trust the doctors in their second language, I think, than in their native language. So people's decision-making in all domains of their life is influenced by the languages that they speak.
Isa?
Sure. I mean, looking at, as our conversation has discussed, throughout, our language shapes our identity, or, how we identify, right? And what that, how we feel connected to some elements or others, right? So for example, when I'm speaking English, I feel less connected to religion, right? I feel less connected to tradition or elements of my cultural aspect, of my cultural background, versus when I'm speaking Polish, I may be in a different frame or making a decision perhaps based on my religious upbringing, right? Again, even just how that frame changes quickly, right? And how I may be making a decision with a completely different set of lens, and a completely different lens and a completely different set of experiences. And that may shape how I make decisions or not, based on a lifetime of experiences in one world and another, right? I think one of the things, in immigrant communities or being bilingual or multilingual, you're in many worlds at the same time. For me, being bilingual, I'm in 2 worlds at the same time. And those 2 worlds go by a very different set of rules, norms, values, and standards, right? So a concrete example in the Polish community, looking at, the common good, looking at the family and sort of making a decision, right? How I may make a decision, I may put, again, religion, family, the group, the thoughts of the group first, versus when I'm thinking in English, I'm simply thinking as a professional, and I'm really just focusing on myself and my career, right? And sometimes it's hard to sort of bridge those two gaps, right? So any sort of decision making is shaped by languages, but also the experiences that come with those languages, and the values and the norms and the customs and traditions. I think growing up in a very, traditional diaspora community, there's a part of me that loves tradition, right? There's a part of me that loves sort of those cultural norms and standards. But in my life, as an American, right, there's less of that than in my Polish one. I think that's why I like higher ed, because higher ed has its own norms, culture, tradition, and standards, right? So that's my little bridge. But you see sort of those differences and experiences. And I can also add that when I'm sort of more in my English zone, I do miss that culture and that tradition and values and norms. And I may make a decision based on that emotional reaction as well. So, tying in our conversation around emotions as well, how does emotionally navigating those two worlds also shape how we make decisions as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent sort of personal reflection of how language and culture are so tightly connected. And then language acts as this framework that brings to forefront different cultural norms, different views of the world, and we bring to the forefront just different identities as a result. So yeah, I like some of the comments that people are making in the chat as well about being nicer in one language versus another.
If I can sort of pick up on that, I was thinking about in preparation for this, and Anna and I have had this conversation a lot, right? Am I a nicer person in English? Right away, Roxana, I was thinking about just how the language is structured, right? We've had this conversation multiple times in Eastern European communities. The language is very direct, to the point, no nonsense, do this and that's it. Right. And there I can go anecdotally on many examples, right, about this. So that is your frame. It is direct. It is not, asking sideways a question. What is English? English has a lot more words. It's less direct. So I know sometimes if I approach my colleagues with my Polish hat on, meaning my language, right, but spoken in American English, what do I come across as? Rude, direct, not maybe, not as collegial, right? But really, I'm just trying to get a directive. If I come to my Polish community with my American hat on, they're gonna be like, what are you trying to ask me? Can you just say it directly, right? Can you just tell us what you want? And I know we have time for questions, but I do have a funny story about an email about this. So, how even the language, the words that we use may make us feel nicer or harsher based on the cultural norms of the language.
And I think we all can relate a little bit to what Roxana said. I was laughing as well, because I totally find myself to be a nicer person in English. I don't know if it's only about directness. It's also about languages that are more unfiltered in communication, which is a difference between being direct or using unfiltered words as well. But it's interesting, and it's not to point that one is better than the other. I think they can complement each other a lot, especially for those of us who don't have other choices because we already speak two languages or more than two. Instead, to bring them together and to allow them to complement each other and to grow together into whatever we want to become. Maybe overcome some of the cultural norms that may not apply to us anymore.
As we consider which questions to get, I'll mention one, since I didn't really talk about my personal experience. I tended to stay close to research and data just to bring it all to you and tell you what the research says. But I will share my personal experience as well, in saying that I think I'm not atypical in the sense that not only do I feel like I live between two languages and between cultures, but it can be challenging to really fit as an individual with your identity in either culture. So I feel like I'm in between two worlds, and that I'm not anymore quite Romanian or Moldovan in how I think I live, because I've been gone for, more than 30 years, 33 years, but I'm also not American. So I'm not communicating the way Americans do, but neither do I communicate the way Romanians do. And I think for people who, especially the sandwich generation, where you have a parent or parents, family members who belong to the heritage culture, and then you have your children who belong to the new American culture, you're just sort of in between, and you don't really have a full, you're neither the way your parents are and nor the way your children are. And of course, there's this intergenerational differences that are always there, but they're further amplified by language, by culture, by just different ways to think shaped by language and culture.
Wonderful. It would be nice to write a book collecting all these personal experiences of living in two cultures or speaking two languages, especially simultaneously, as I do in sessions. It's like it's always like back and forth between English and Romanian. Let's hear from the audience. I'm very curious to hear if anybody has questions or comments here in the chat, or maybe on Facebook. Roxana, any news there? Do you have anything for us?
Yes, I
from
do. I'm
Anne.
sorry. I just typed a question in chat from somebody on Facebook, from Anne.
Okay.
Can you see that,
Yeah.
Mihaela?
Yes, I do. Okay, so Anne is asking this question. Hi, following up on the question of children and bilingualism, I wonder how much of that advice is given by pediatricians/teachers, or is a stereotype that has been transmitted through the diaspora itself. I live in Connecticut and have children with speech issues, but at no point in time any professional suggested not to speak two languages at home.
I wanted to add on this. This thought I found in Dr. Marian's book, about parents continuing to be encouraged not to teach their kids their own native language. I personally didn't advise myself either, but there are more indirect ways to what I like, discouraging more than encouraging to teach the kids English directly. So, and this applies more to kids that have developmental disorders or autism, more who cannot find a speech language pathologist that has bilingual fluency in both English and the language spoken at home. So yeah, it's a point. I mean, pediatricians are being more educated than before on this topic, but there's still problems that are related to the supports diasporas have to encourage language preservations. Now I will let our guest
I think it's really wonderful to hear that Anne's experience is such that professionals do not say that bilingualism is a negative for her children. It's wonderful to hear this, and I think there is really a push to educate speech language pathologists to understand that. There are now programs that provide courses. We at Northwestern do as well on bilingualism and multilingualism. There are even sometimes certificates or minors that students can take to really be able to distinguish between difference versus disorder, because sometimes difference, like a language difference, like in bilinguals and multilinguals, presents itself in a child in the same way as a language disorder. So often bilinguals are overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed because of this conflated difference versus disorder thing. So Connecticut, of course, has overall very high levels of education among its population. And it's great to hear that that hasn't been her experience. In the diaspora, it also varies. Some people share this belief. Often we think that bilinguals just want to use their native language. And that's the case sometimes, but not all the time. Many immigrants really want their children to assimilate and not to be seen as other, and not to have, really encourage their children to learn English. So the biases are often not by professionals, but by us ourselves in the diaspora community. And hopefully this book and conversations like this can help dispel those misconceptions and biases.
We hope so too. And if we don't have more questions or comments, we would like to thank you for participating in this interesting, amazing conversation. We touched on different issues. I'm sure there are so many more to be discussed. Maybe we'll do another event like this at some point. In any case, I appreciate, and the organization thanks you for being here with us tonight and for giving us all this food for thought, because everything that has been discussed, it's so interesting and it requires definitely more thinking, deeper thinking. Mm-hmm. And with that, I think we will end the Facebook Live